Hello, and welcome to In the Dirt from the Gravel Ride podcast. I'm your host, Craig Dalton. I'm going to be joined shortly by my co-host, Randall Jacobs. Each episode, we tackle the ins and outs of gravel and adventure cycling in the interests of providing you information, fostering community, and generally sharing the stoke. In the Dirt is sponsored by listener contributions from listeners just like you. You can visit buymeacoffee.com/thegravelride to join our membership program, to choose one-time perks, or generally just send us a cup of coffee. And if you have a second right now, ratings and reviews are critically important to our success. So when you're done with the podcast this week, in your favorite podcast app, just leave us a rating or a review. If you're interested in connecting with us and other gravel cyclists in between shows, we've created the Ridership forum just for that purpose. You can visit www.theridership.com to get your invite. With all that said, let's jump right into this week's episode. Randall, how are you this week?
I'm doing okay. It's a challenging week amidst lockdown and colder weather, though fortunately here in the Bay, it hasn't been too rainy, so able to get outside. How about yourself? You're down in LA.
I feel like every answer this year has to have an asterisk by it, and I would be suspect if anybody said, I'm doing awesome. This is great. I had the best week. I feel like there's been very few weeks in 2020 where I could say I've had the best week. I've had a pretty rough one, as a matter of fact. Still dealing with some serious family issues down here in Los Angeles, and still super frustrated that I have not been able to get out and meet people down here. It's such a mess down in Los Angeles as it is that while I've had overtures to have people guide me on rides, I've just had to politely decline just to be part of the solution and not the problem.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a year of immense challenges for everybody, and not really having the sorts of outlets that we may have had in the past in order to work through, particularly social outlets, being able to go out and connect with people and have shared experiences in the way that can be really uplifting. That's super hard. I feel your pain, and I suspect a lot of people in the audience are feeling similarly.
Yeah, I feel like the podcast has allowed me to develop this community and this voice and this conversation with the community that was this great jumping off point. And I felt like when I was coming down to Los Angeles, it'd be really easy to meet people. And again, it has. I just haven't been able to meet anybody face to face and kind of consummate those relationships over a nice bike ride.
My original plan for the year was to be traveling around the country, living in the back of my converted Prius, which I do promise to get some pictures and or a video up soon. The build out is almost done, so a few people have asked for that in the forum. But traveling around the country and just attending events and embedding in communities and connecting and that went out the window pretty quickly back in February, March.
Totally. I do feel like, with the Ridership forum, we're building the groundwork for those type of adventures to be easier and easier for others to have, including ourselves.
Yeah.
Just, we've got all those regions set up and people are talking and posting rides. I mean, I'm optimistic about at some point in the future, we'll be able to hit the road and get out there and experience some new gravel.
Hopefully as more people get vaccinated, it will be possible to have, say, meet up with somebody who also has some verification of vaccination in order to go out for a ride. And hopefully there'll be some sort of passport for that or other mechanism for signaling that. And, I have some family and friends in epidemiology and in the medical field, and they suggest that could be, viable as soon as, early summer or so on. It's not going to be herd immunity, so it won't be, nobody's going to concerts or Burning Man. But maybe, smaller gatherings where everybody has proof will be something to look forward to a little bit sooner than that herd immunity scenario.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. In our last discussion, I talked a lot about some of my favorite podcasts over the year and some of the things that I wanted to highlight. But one of the things I felt like was totally missing was just the state of the bicycle business in 2020. I think it affected a lot of listeners. I got a lot of communications from people who were looking to buy bikes and couldn't find bikes in their size or couldn't find anything available. And that was driving what bike they ended up getting on. So, given your brand thesis and everything you went through this year and your experience in the bike biz, I just thought it would be useful to just talk about the state of the bike biz in 2020 and what trends we're seeing and what are we going to look forward to in 2021.
Sure. Let's do it.
Anecdotally speaking, and certainly from the kids' bike perspective and a lot of gravel bikes, there was a bike boom, but there was the supply drought. Can you just sort of break down from your perspective what was going on in 2020 and what was creating these long lead times? Why weren't bikes available?
So I'll kind of frame this in the context of our personal experience that I think is broadly applicable to a lot of players. Though bigger players would have had a different experience because they would have had different constraints. But when the pandemic first hit, there was a huge crash in demand. So back in March, like all kind of discretionary buying went away. In a big way. And so with us, that was reflected in a bunch of order cancellations. And so, I was talking with friends at other brands and they were seeing, having similar concerns and other just small businesses generally. And then April came around and all of a sudden, everyone realizes they're going to be in for the long haul. And, there's no gym, there's no yoga studio, there's no all the other things that you would usually do. And you're not commuting to the office every day. So you have this extra time. A bicycle all of a sudden becomes really appealing. So then there was this huge spike. April, May, June were, I believe record sales across the board. We certainly saw a big boom internally that we were on the one hand excited about. And then on the other hand, the flip side has been, the same thing that created that boom, the pandemic also made it so that, there was a huge slowdown in supply that lag, continues to this day. And, I can tell you a little bit about, our, the experience across the industry in the past few months, which has been intense.
Yeah, I think, people often don't think about physical products and how they don't just get manufactured overnight. And maybe as a manufacturer, you're believing in a trend and you might take a bigger inventory position at a certain point. But that bigger inventory position might have been ordering 15% more or something of that magnitude. It wasn't like you ordered 50% more to lean into this boom. And I think that's where everybody got caught with their pants down.
So on the one hand, there's the ordering, but at the end of the day, the ability to produce is still what it is. And that was significantly hampered by, the fact that, China was where this thing kicked off. And so they were getting their situation under control. They did a much better job than we did. And in fact, they're expecting overall growth this year, GDP growth this year, and probably up at, they're predicting about 8% next year. Taiwan also saw a significant decline in capacity as they got their situation under control. Now, they've managed it very well. And so I haven't seen figures on relative production capacity. I suspect it's down a little bit. But overall, they have not had the huge flare-ups that we've had that have resulted in pretty massive declines sustained over time. Other things happening. So we had this boom. We had a lack of supply. There was kind of a trigger point over the summer, early fall of this year, where vendors started reaching out saying, "Hey, our lead times that are usually 30 to 60 days." It's now 200, right? And that happened. There was one vendor, in our case, the first we heard from was a vendor called Velo, who run by a lovely woman, and they supply most of the saddles and bar tape, particularly to the mid to high end range for the industry. And they sent an email out saying 200 plus days. And then all of a sudden you started getting emails from a bunch of different vendors saying similar things. And this, caused what I would describe as something of a bank run, in the sense that everybody was concerned they weren't going to get the parts that they needed. So all of a sudden everybody is ordering. And the terms of ordering at the time were such that you could cancel an order if you don't need it. And so that led people to just kind of order with abandon. And so then lead times went to 300 days, 400 days, right? Wow. There are some vendors where if you order right now, they're expecting to deliver in, say, 2022.
Yeah. I imagine as a smaller brand, smaller brands are ordering maybe 10 Grupos or 20 Grupos. Mm-hmm. But the bigger manufacturers are probably ordering 400 Grupos. So it's easy to see the manufacturers themselves, the vendors of these products, they're going to go with the 400 person with a large bank account, the 400 unit order versus, 40 10 unit orders.
Yep. And there's also bigger brands tend to have, more robust forecasting. They're getting they're locking in their orders from their dealers in advance, right? So the dealers are kind of locked into a certain buy, and then the forecast for production is handed off to the vendors, and they're, generally giving those forecasts, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months out. Now vendors are asking for that kind of across the board, which is a new dynamic, this kind of just in time model, which is what, smaller brands like us tend to do, is no longer viable in this space where, you're 400 days out. So it's a very different dynamic.
I think it's going to continue to put a lot of stress on that side of the market. And it's probably something the listener should take as a takeaway, in terms of, you may fall in love with that frame set, but getting the components to build it up is going to be a challenge. So make sure you're out ahead of that as well.
Yeah, for sure. In our case, we'll run out of group sets in probably the next month or so. We have another batch coming in April. But, brands like us will have to shift to, doing frame sales or frame set module sales, and otherwise kind of adapting to this changing environment.
Yeah, it's super frustrating, I think, both for you, I can only imagine, and for the consumer as well, because, we were entering at the end of 2019 this world of plenty of opportunities, plenty of possibilities in terms of picking up a new bike quickly and whatever you wanted and customizing it. And now we're back to kind of, ages ago where it's like we've only got a certain number of models available on the floor.
Yeah. There's another thing that I think might be interesting to listeners, which is to just really explain how complex these supply chains are. Right? You think about a bicycle, it's like, oh, there's a factory that makes a bicycle. Well, every one of those components may have a different vendor. And if you can't get center lock rotor lock rings for your complete bike, you don't have a complete bike that you can sell. And your lock rings might be a different vendor than the rotor, might be a different vendor than your levers, your cassette, and so on. And all of those vendors have sub-vendors as well. So maybe you have a vendor that makes a cassette and they source the aluminum spider from an external vendor who can do it more cheaply, and they focus on the rings and the assembly. So you have all this complexity in the supply chain, and all of this was, working in normal times, but these are not normal times. And so any sort of kink in those chains has this cascading effect, because now not only can you not get the part, but you're waiting for the part to come in, and then that might result in you missing, say, your slotting for like a paint run or something like this. So It really is like, if you're waiting on a bicycle, and granted I have some self-interest here, but have some compassion for the folks on the other side. And at the same time, also, like, we are responsible for, showing, for following up on the promises made. So I deeply appreciate those who've been patient with us, and I suspect other companies do as well.
Well, I think it goes down to the local bike shop level as well. You start, I hear stories of people, to your point, like just trying to get a simple rotor, which you could probably go out to any store and get in past times. And now, it's just not there. And the shop's like, I've got an order in from 6 weeks ago that still hasn't arrived. I have no idea when that part's coming in.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this affects the dynamics with local shops. There had been a trend towards, there'd been a decline in the total number of shops for quite some time. And shops have, on average, not been making money on the sale of new bicycles for quite some time. Now, during the boom, there was less discounting. So, they probably did all right, maybe last year if they had inventory. But now if you can't get inventory, you have all this square footage, you have all this team that is there to sell bikes and so on. So I think that could very well accelerate the trend towards fewer shops that are less bike focused, sales focused, and much more focused on service and parts and accessories and things like that.
Yeah,
I'll be interesting. Continue.
It'll be interesting. I haven't checked in with my local shop up in Mill Valley, but previously, it was like a 6-week wait to get some repair work done.
Yeah, I'm hearing similar things. 3 weeks, 5 weeks.
It'll be interesting. And I also wonder if, simple economics is going to suggest that a lot of these trends are going to lead to rising prices.
I think it already is. Certainly, discounting will go away, right? And discounting is something that happens quite a bit in our industry, and with model years and end of year sales and so on. But you're already seeing increased prices from certain vendors, and of course, supply and demand. It makes sense, and it's a balancing mechanism in a market economy. I suspect that hopefully it'll result. The backlog in labor will result in more opportunities for mechanics and also higher wages for what is a relatively high-skilled, low-paid role.
Yeah.
So that could be one upside. Granted, not for those having to pay for it, but certainly for the people doing the work.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I actually heard you talk about on another podcast, The Path Less Pedaled, was just the idea of producing stuff in the U.S. when international relations and international transit and all these things become stressed. Does it create an opportunity to build more here in the U.S.?
It certainly creates the opportunity. The challenge is, we talked earlier about the depth and complexity of supply chains, and building up those supply chains requires a clear and sustained industrialization policy, which is what China engaged in, what Taiwan engaged in to build up their industries. And so it's not as simple as just we're going to start making this part here, right? So let's say you're going to make making a frame is relatively easy, which is why you see a lot of particularly metal frame fabrication happening here. It's not necessarily economically competitive price-wise relative to doing it at scale in Asia, but you see it done here in a boutique fashion. But let's say you wanted to make, a derailleur, right? Well, are you going to make every part of that derailleur in-house? That's a lot of different manufacturing steps. Usually what will happen is for a smaller company trying to get off the ground, they will source a significant number of the components from other subcontractors and then bring them in, and they do the design and the assembly and the marketing and so on. But if you don't have the depth of that supply chain, it's really hard to get that off the ground. And then of course, well, that's just a derailleur. To make a complete bike, you need depth of supply chain across the entire component spectrum. And otherwise, you still have to do assembly where the most of the components are made. So you could, the US could be economically, financially advantaged in some subset of components. They can do it cheaper here for some reason. But because the whole collection of components is not done here, and assembly is still done there for that reason, it's hard to shift that. So it really requires policy.
That's quite a conundrum. Yeah, I could see that. Like if you for some reason were able to make a chain in the US, but you had to ship it back to Taiwan to be part of the original assembly, whatever delta in performance or cost that you could achieve in the US is surely negated by shipping it back to Taiwan to be part of the assembly process.
Yeah. So, there are opportunities to get this process started. It's actually, I'm been advising on a project that's looking at the viability of this. So you kind of start with frame fabrication and sourcing what you can domestically, but then bringing everything else in containers directly from Taiwan, consolidating there, and then doing assembly here. And that would be one way to kind of jumpstart this process. And then over time, you slowly add production capacity for other types of components, and you build up that base. But you need a 10-year plan for this, and our political system doesn't really allow for much planning at all, really.
Yeah, and the bike business certainly isn't on the top of the list of any government functionaries' desires to bring back onshore very specifically.
Yeah.
That's interesting stuff, and we'll have to keep watching that. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was just trends in gravel bike design in 2020. I think there's a couple things that probably stand out as trends, and I'd be interested to get your take on them.
Well, what are you seeing? Let's put you in the...
I often talk about wider tire capacity as being something I desire. And I've had conversations with you in the past, and we should definitely do it on air now, about the trade-off, right? Because it's easy for me to sit back and say, oh, I'd love to run a 2.2 on occasion, or a 2.4 if I went bike packing on my bike. And it's somewhat frustrating that I can't do that on my current bike. I probably don't need it on a daily basis, but I'm interested in that trend. I'm interested in that flexibility of being able to run a bigger tire. What are the trade-offs there?
Honestly, with the exception of, say, like to accommodate a bigger tire in the rear, you need a wider Q factor crank. So, which is not a huge deal. And on smaller sizes, the bigger radius of the tire means that either toe overlap becomes an issue, or you have to kind of slack out the front end, which makes the steering, not quite as snappy as on the larger bikes. But truth is, like, you can build a bike that can accommodate a 2.2 or even up to a 2.4, like you see on the Open Wide, which does have a slightly more slacked out front end, and the 3T Race Max, Exploro, Race Max. I don't know if I get the order there, something of that sort. They're fitting 2.4s in there with geometries that are still pretty sporty. So there's really no downside. Aesthetically, some people might not like the double drop stay necessary to accommodate that bigger tire, but otherwise, that it's a trend that makes a ton of sense, and people have figured out how to squeeze in a bigger tire without otherwise compromising the ride experience. So that'll be a trend that continues.
Yeah, I imagine the sort of design philosophy when building these bikes initially, going back 4 or 5 years, was more around a cyclocross chassis and or a road bike chassis, and just making them more off-road capable. So it's pretty natural that someone was like, "Eureka, we can fit a 700 by 40 tire in here." But now I think as the category has grown to be its own beast and riders are defining what they want these bikes to do, I think that's where the larger tires are starting to come into play.
Yeah, and I do still feel like having ridden a spectrum of different bikes and tire sizes, I still find that 650 by 47 is kind of a certain sweet spot in terms of volume and weight and suppleness and rolling efficiency and so on for like rough mixed terrain riding where you're on the road for a bit and then you're hitting, I'm hitting some significant like downhill single track sections, granted not big routes and stuff like that. But having the ability to throw on a 2.2, even if it's a little bit heavier and more ponderous and so on, having the ability to do so when you're tackling that bigger, more rugged adventure is a feature that's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, I do tend to agree with you that 47 by 650 is a size that it's got some constraints around it, but it's constraining you so that you can have performance on the road and very, very solid off-road performance in the same bike.
Yeah, and it maintains the handling of the bike too, which is something that a lot of people aren't cognizant of. But as the tire, as the radius increases, the handling becomes slower, and the measure of that would be the trail figure, which I won't get into explaining, but it's a measure of how responsive the steering is to inputs. Essentially, you can think of it that way.
Yeah. And speaking of inputs, like think as these bikes and riders have been pushing the capability of these bikes, we are starting to see a trend towards wider handlebars.
Yeah, which I know you got on. And yep. Are you on the wide handlebar train for good?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the type of riding I do just lends itself for a rig that's set up more off-road oriented versus road oriented. The amount of road riding I do, which is so minimal right now, I don't mind riding the 48s that I'm on that type of terrain. If I was doing it all the time, I think I would go narrower again. But for the type of riding I focus on, absolutely.
I think that I do agree that we'll see a trend towards wider bars, and especially wider bars. Well, I think the style that makes the most sense is a bend, which is a bit more complex and thus more expensive to make, but that keeps the hoods in a relatively neutral position, maybe a little bit of flare, but then gets a lot of flare at the drops. And then in that way, you kind of maintain the ergonomics on the hoods, which is where you're doing most of your riding on the road anyways. And then if you're, flared out in the drops for road descending, it's actually not a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing. Like all these things take a long design cycle in order to figure out. First, you need the input from the athletes to say, hey, this is a challenge or an opportunity. Then the product designer needs to get on it. Then they need to advocate for the investment in it. Then they need to do the tooling. So it's a long process. And what's been cool about gravel is like we're starting to see the fruition of those labors that most likely started 2 years ago to try to achieve these products that are making these bikes so much fun to ride today.
Yeah, and it speaks to another trend, which is the cannibalization of road bike sales by gravel bikes. Like, how many people do we know that have, just a gravel bike with 2 wheel sets, or maybe they have a road bike because they had one before, but they don't really ride it anymore.
Yeah, it's totally true. I mean, I think, again, if you're on the side of the gravel sport of, less aggro terrain, you can have a bike that is a supercharged bike on the road and handles the light off-road duty very readily. I just can't see the reason to purchase a new road bike at this point.
Yeah, especially given that they might not necessarily accommodate a dropper post, which is something I'll never do without on a bike again.
Oh man! So the other trend that you had highlighted for me was just the trend around electronic shifting and where that is going.
Yeah, it's going to continue to come down in price. For better or worse. I do think that there's a lot of excitement around electronic shifting. It is, but it's heavier. It's more expensive to buy up front. Is a battery to charge and so on. The wireless systems have multiple batteries, and it kind of locks you into a certain ecosystem. So I'm not sold on it for myself. I won't be going electronic next year, but there are some things that I suspect will be coming down the pipe that will make electronic shifting more accessible.
Yeah, I sort of vacillate back and forth. I often find myself like heavily desiring electronic shifting, but when I sort of do the math and sort of think about the practicality of it, I'm still pretty darn happy with since I'm running a 1x drivetrain, having that rear derailleur cable is just not that big of an issue for me.
Yeah, the thing for me, and I'm just going to soapbox for a moment. I previously worked on a project called Open Bike. We were trying to build an open electronics and software platform for bike. And just the fact that you can have multiple devices on the bike, all of them using separate batteries, like that we haven't solved for that yet, seems to me quite silly. And, if you had a single battery that powered a lighting system and a rear derailleur and the shifter and that other things could plug into. It doesn't even need, it can communicate wirelessly, right? Let it communicate over an open Bluetooth protocol so that, everything, stuff from different component makers can interoperate, which is something that big component makers are loath to allow. But that would make things more compelling for me. But then, that would be an experience that could be quite compelling. You could imagine, say, like, you have a phone mount that's in there too, and that can be charged as you're riding. You have a dynamo hub that is going through a rectifier to keep the battery topped off. Imagine that for bike packing and adventure riding. You always have power available. Yeah,
we talk about the complexity of a single product from a single manufacturer being realized. And then, as you imagined and just have spoken to, multiple parties getting involved and creating a standard, there's so many challenges there that, that feels like it's a 5-year, 10-year long endeavor to try to get to that point.
The challenges are actually less technical and much more political.
Yeah.
Every company wants to create their monopoly. Every company wants to be able to say, like, if you're going to buy my shifters, you're going to buy my derailleurs. And if you're going to buy my derailleurs, I'll only sell it to you if you're going to buy the crankset and the cassette. And I'm going to make a special chain that only works with my cogs and all this other stuff to kind of lock you in, which, is unfortunately the way that our commerce tends to work generally, not just in the bike industry.
Yeah, it's a little bit frustrating.
Yeah.
Well, moving away from equipment itself, were there some trends in how you saw people riding this past year? I certainly recognized one.
Well, I don't see a lot of people crit racing or racing generally.
Yes, that is true. Elbow to elbow crit racing has not been deemed COVID safe.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, like, the bike boom brought out a lot of people who were new to the sport. And those who were new to the sport and who've been riding for a long time, I mean, you don't have racers didn't have those events, but then the rest of us, I think, a trend away from the road and towards more mixed terrain riding. You see that reflected in the events that were planned. There's a big boom in events planned, but then also, sales, and just anecdotally, locally, you see a lot of people on gravel bikes in groups of 2, 3, 4 people riding socially distant with masks. So that trend towards, getting away from pure road riding definitely seems to be something. And also, without events available, going out and riding for experience, for adventure, explore your area.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we talked about it in the last episode 13, about mass events and virtual events. And, some of these trends are definitely going to continue forward. The way I've been thinking about it, I often have a big gravel event on the calendar as something to train for, something to keep me focused. I operate very well in the fear. I'm afraid I'm going to fail and not be able to ride 100 miles off road. So that gets my butt out the door, gets me on the bike, and keeps me training. And I think, if 2020 has taught us anything, it's just this idea that with mapping technology, with communities like the Ridership out there, it's easy to source information about different places to go. And in the United States and Europe, all over the world, there's so many amazing places to ride. And I think one of the trends I'm hopeful is going to remain is the idea of planning a big destination trip. If you think about it, sometimes going to a race can be very limiting because you show up, you want to perform well, there's nervous energy. So it's not like you're going on a 50-mile ride the day before a 100-mile race. But if you travel somewhere, if you go somewhere just to experience the terrain, you're going to ride as long as you can. Every single day you can mount a bike while you're there. And that's the type of trip that really gets me excited to get back to in 2021. I just want to put a destination on the map. I want to bring a small group of friends and just ride our little tails off.
The vision that really excites me, and that I hope that the Ridership and other tools can facilitate, is one where anybody who wants to go and have an experience, whether it be a solo or an experience with their immediate friends in some new route, can find information about it. But then also, if you want to go to some destination, be like, hey, I want to join, like, who's local, who knows, who can take me around? What are the group rides that are available in this area? More tools and opportunities for connecting more broadly as a community in this more kind of fluid and spontaneous way is something that really excites me, and that I hope, I look at how technology has been used in cycling until now, and it's mostly around performance and, kind of broadcasting the riding that you're doing. Like Strava is not really a great tool for community, in my opinion. Because it's hard to schedule events and coordinate things, and all you can do is like give a thumbs up and a comment. So having more opportunities to really facilitate offline experiences and connections and so on is something that I see happening out of necessity within COVID, and I hope that will continue and that we can help to facilitate some of that.
Very well said, Randall. And I think that's a very useful and optimistic view of 2021. And I actually think it's a perfect place to leave the conversation. This is going to be our last call of 2020, the last podcast I'm going to get out the door, fingers crossed. So I think we should leave it on that. And for the listener out there, I think both Randall and I were very much looking forward to continuing to connect with you in 2021. We definitely want to hear from you in the Ridership forum. And when it's safe, man, we definitely want to get together. We want to pull some groups together and do some amazing things together.
Yeah, and I will add to that by just saying thank you for being part of this journey with us, both Craig in the podcast and also with my endeavors. And it's really been very gratifying to be part of this community, and we're excited to continue growing it, nurturing it in the new year.
Yeah, cheers. Happy New Year, my man.
Happy New Year, Craig.
So that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us on this journey all year long. This is our last episode of the year. We're wishing you a happy new year. We're excited for 2021 and the adventures that we're all going to have, hopefully, together. For the final time this year, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.